Imagine being pushed out of your own family party while everyone was watching, champagne still warm in their hands, laughter hanging in the air like it belonged to someone else. Imagine your father standing there, red-faced and righteous, telling you to leave because you embarrassed his favorite daughter. Imagine the music stopping just long enough for everyone to hear him say, "You're not welcome here anymore." That was the moment I learned something that took me decades to understand. Some families don't fall apart in private. They break you in public so the shame sticks. I remember standing there with my coat half on, my heart pounding so loudly I couldn't hear my own thoughts, and realizing this wasn't about what I said or what I did. It was about who he had already decided I was: disposable, replaceable, easy to sacrifice to keep the peace. What he didn't know, what none of them knew as they watched me walk out with my head held high and my stomach twisting in knots, was that I wasn't leaving empty-handed. I wasn't leaving powerless. And by the time the sun came up the next morning, everything they thought they knew about me, about control, about money, about family, was about to turn inside out. The party had been my aunt's anniversary celebration, one of those loud family gatherings that looked perfect in photos and felt suffocating if you stayed too long. It was held in my father's house, the same house I grew up in, the same living room where I learned early on how to smile without saying too much. I was 30 years old, standing near the back of the room, nursing a drink I didn't really want, telling myself I could get through one evening. Just one. I had learned how to survive those nights. Keep your voice low. Don't contradict anyone. Don't draw attention, especially not when my sister was around. She stood at the center of the room like she always did, laughing a little too loudly, touching my father's arm when she spoke, making sure every story circled back to her. She was 2 years younger than me, but somehow had always felt older in the ways that mattered. Louder, bolder, protected. The golden child everyone tiptoed around so she wouldn't feel slighted. I had stopped resenting it years ago, or at least that's what I told myself. Resentment took too much energy, and I had learned early that no one was interested in hearing how I felt anyway. The trouble started over something small. It always does. A joke she made about her promotion, how she had finally outgrown our hometown. Someone asked what I had been up to lately. Before I could answer, she laughed and said, "She's always been private. You know how she is. Secretive." The word landed wrong. I smiled, the way I'd been trained to, but something in me shifted. I corrected her gently. I said I wasn't secretive, just careful. That was it. That single sentence. Her smile froze. I saw it happen, the way her eyes flicked toward my father, searching for backup. He stepped in immediately, his voice sharp, louder than it needed to be. He told me not to start anything. He told me I always did this, turned harmless moments into drama. I tried to explain, tried to keep my tone calm, but the room had already chosen a side. People looked away, someone turned the music down. And then my father said the words that would echo in my head for weeks afterward. "If you can't behave, you can leave." I remember looking at him, really looking and realizing there was no confusion in his face, no hesitation. He wasn't asking, he was choosing her comfort over my presence, like he always had. I asked him if he was serious. He didn't answer me, he just pointed toward the door. The silence was worse than the shouting would have been. I felt every eye on me as I set my glass down, smoothed my dress, and reached for my coat. My sister didn't say a word. She didn't need to. She had already won. As I walked past her, she leaned in and whispered, "You do this to yourself." Her breath smelled like wine and certainty. The door closed behind me with a finality that felt familiar. I stood on the porch for a moment, breathing in the cold night air, my hands shaking despite myself. I told myself not to cry. I had cried enough in that house growing up, always quietly, always alone. I walked to my car, my heels clicking against the driveway, and only when I was inside did I let my forehead fall against the steering wheel. Not because I missed them, not because I wanted to go back, but because something inside me finally snapped. I didn't drive away right away. I sat there and thought about all the other times I'd been made to feel like an outsider in my own family. The birthdays where my sister's wishes mattered more. The holidays where I was asked to be understanding, to be flexible, to be the bigger person. The way my father used to say, "She's sensitive, you're strong, you can handle it." I had handled it for years. I had swallowed words, softened my edges, shrunk myself down until there was barely anything left to push out the door. And still, it wasn't enough. When I finally drove away, the house faded in my rearview mirror, lights glowing warmly for everyone else. I didn't know where I was going yet. I just knew I wasn't going back that night. Or ever, if I could help it. My phone buzzed before I made it to the end of the street. A text from my father. "We'll talk when you've learned to behave." I laughed then, a short, bitter sound that surprised me. Behave. Like I was a child who had spoken out of turn. Like my worth was tied to how well I stayed silent. By the time I got home, my phone was full of missed calls and messages from relatives. None of them asked if I was okay. They asked what happened. They asked why I couldn't just let things go. They asked why I always had to make things difficult. I didn't respond. I put my phone face down on the counter and stood in the quiet of my apartment, listening to the hum of the refrigerator, the distant sound of traffic. The silence felt heavy, but it also felt honest. I poured myself a glass of water and sat at my small kitchen table staring at the wall. That was when the thought came to me, uninvited, but undeniable. I don't need their permission anymore. It felt strange, almost dangerous to think it. Like stepping off a path I'd been walking my entire life. I had spent so many years measuring myself against their expectations, trying to earn a seat at a table that never really wanted me there. And suddenly, after being kicked out in front of everyone, I realized something terrifying and freeing all at once. They no longer had anything to take from me. That night, I didn't sleep much. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw my father's face, the way he pointed toward the door without looking back. I heard my sister's whisper. But beneath the hurt, beneath the familiar ache of rejection, something else was growing. Not anger, not revenge. Awareness. The kind that comes when you finally see a pattern clearly enough that you can't unsee it. I got up before sunrise and made coffee, watching the light slowly creep into the room. My phone buzzed again. Another message from my father. This one longer. Disappointed, embarrassed. Family doesn't treat each other this way. The irony would have been funny if it hadn't hurt so much for so long. I deleted it without replying. As the morning wore on, I started thinking about how easily he had chosen her, how natural it seemed to him. And that's when I understood that the party wasn't the cause of my exile. It was just the excuse. He had been defending her my entire life. I had been the buffer, the quiet one, the one who absorbed the tension so she could shine. The night before hadn't changed anything. It had just exposed it. I stood by my window, coffee cooling in my hands, and looked out at the city waking up. People heading to work, lives moving forward. I felt oddly calm, hurt, yes, but clear. For the first time, I wasn't scrambling to fix things, to smooth things over, to make myself smaller so someone else could feel bigger. I wasn't planning an apology. I wasn't rehearsing explanations. I was done begging to belong. My phone buzzed one more time. This time it was my sister. "We need to talk." I stared at the message for a long moment, then set the phone down again. Not now, maybe not ever. They thought pushing me out would teach me a lesson. They thought I'd come crawling back, embarrassed, eager to make things right. What they didn't understand yet was that being kicked out of that house, in front of everyone, had finally given me something I hadn't had before. Freedom. And standing there in the quiet of my own space, watching the sun rise on a life that no longer revolved around their approval, I made myself a promise. I wouldn't explain. I wouldn't defend. And when the truth finally came out, when they realized exactly who they had thrown away, it would be too late to pretend we were family again. The morning after the party felt quieter than it should have. Not peaceful, just hollow. I woke up before my alarm, the kind of early that comes from your body being tired of carrying things your mind hasn't sorted out yet. For a few seconds I forgot where I was, forgot the way my father's voice had cut through the room, forgot the weight of everyone watching me walk out. Then it all rushed back, sharp and undeniable, settling in my chest like a familiar ache. My phone was face down on the nightstand. I didn't need to look at it to know it was full. I could already imagine the messages, the carefully worded disappointment, the concern that wasn't really concern at all. When I finally turned it over, the screen lit up with exactly what I expected. Missed calls from relatives I barely spoke to anymore, long texts from people who hadn't checked on me in years, suddenly invested in my behavior, and one message from my father, sent just after sunrise. "We'll talk when you've learned to behave." I stared at the words longer than I should have. There it was again, the assumption that I was the problem, that my reaction, not his action, was the issue. I didn't reply. I set the phone back down and sat up in bed, pressing my feet against the floor, grounding myself in the simple fact that I was alone and no one was about to burst in and tell me how I should feel. I made coffee and stood in my kitchen, watching steam curl into the air, feeling the quiet settle around me. The silence wasn't empty. It was observant, like it was waiting to see what I would do next. For the first time in a long time, there was no immediate role for me to play. No apology to draft, no peace to keep. That realization felt unsettling, like stepping into a room without furniture. My phone buzzed again. This time it was my aunt. "Sweetheart, your father is really hurt. You know how sensitive your sister is. You could have just let it go." I didn't respond. Another message followed from a cousin. "Families fight. Don't throw everything away over one night." One night. As if that night hadn't been built on decades of smaller ones just like it. I carried my coffee to the window and looked out at the street below. People moved through their routines, unaware that somewhere above them a woman was finally questioning the story she'd been telling herself her entire life. I thought about how easily everyone framed it as my overreaction, how quickly they closed ranks around the version of events that made them comfortable. And that was when I felt it again, that old familiar sensation of being edited out of my own experience. It wasn't the first time. When I was a child, there were always two versions of every story in our house. The one that actually happened, and the one that was easier for my father to accept. My sister learned early which version he preferred. I learned just as early how to stay quiet when the truth wasn't welcome. I remember a birthday party when I was maybe 10. My sister had wanted a different cake than the one ordered, and she'd thrown a tantrum loud enough for the neighbors to hear. When I tried to calm her down, she screamed that I was ruining everything. My father snapped at me, told me to stop provoking her, told me I should know better. Later that night, he pulled me aside and said, "She's sensitive. You're strong. You'll understand." I nodded, because that was what I did. I understood that my job was to absorb the fallout so she didn't have to. That pattern followed us into adulthood. When she missed deadlines, it was because she was under pressure. When I set boundaries, I was being difficult. When she cried, it was an emergency. When I went quiet, it was confirmation that I was cold. My father didn't see it as favoritism. He saw it as balance. Someone had to bend, and it was never going to be her. My sister perfected the art of standing just close enough to him that he felt needed. She didn't have to lie outright. She only had to frame things carefully. A sigh here, a wounded look there. She knew exactly when to speak and when to let him fill in the gaps himself. I used to think it was unconscious, that she didn't realize what she was doing. But as I got older, I understood that some people learn manipulation the same way others learn language. Slowly, naturally, by watching what works. There was a moment years ago when I almost said something. We were all sitting at the dinner table, and my sister had accused me of being unsupportive because I didn't attend one of her events. I calmly explained that I had been working late, that I'd told her in advance. My father didn't even look at me. He just said, "You always have an excuse." That was the day I learned that facts didn't matter if they threatened the story he'd already chosen. Standing in my kitchen that morning, I realized how little had changed. The party hadn't exposed a flaw in me. It had exposed the system. A system where my role was to be the sacrifice that kept everything else intact. My phone rang again. This time I answered without thinking. It was my uncle, his voice gentle but firm. "Your dad didn't mean to embarrass you. He's under a lot of stress. You know how your sister gets when she feels attacked." I closed my eyes as he spoke, each word landing exactly where it always had. Somehow, even now, I was being asked to understand everyone else's feelings, while my own were treated like an inconvenience. I told him I needed some space. He sighed, disappointed, as if I'd failed a test I didn't know I was taking. After I hung up, I sat at the table and let the weight of it all settle. The more I thought about it, the clearer it became. My father wasn't unaware of what he was doing. He needed the dynamic exactly as it was. My sister made him feel important. I made his life easier by not demanding anything. That was the truth no one wanted to say out loud. As the day went on, more messages came in. Different people, same script. Concern wrapped in accusation. Advice that assumed guilt. No one asked what had actually been said. No one asked how it felt to be told to leave your childhood home in front of a room full of people. They had already decided who needed correcting. Late in the afternoon, one message stood out. It was from a distant relative I hadn't spoken to in years. "Your sister says you've been unstable lately." That word again. Unstable. It had always been their favorite, vague enough to discredit me without requiring proof. I felt something cold settle in my stomach. This wasn't just damage control. It was character assassination. I scrolled back through the thread of messages, reading them with new eyes. The patterns were obvious now. The shared language, the subtle pressure, the way responsibility was shifted, redistributed, diluted until it no longer landed where it belonged. I wasn't imagining it. I never had. As evening approached, I found myself thinking about things I hadn't allowed myself to question before. The arguments that ended abruptly when certain topics came up. The relatives we never talked about. The one time years ago when my father had snapped, "That money was never meant for you," and then refused to explain what he meant. I'd brushed it off then, assuming it was just another way of reminding me of my place. Now it felt like a loose thread. I didn't pull on it. Not yet. I wasn't ready to know where it led. But I made a mental note. Some truths take time to surface, and I had learned the hard way that rushing them only got you burned. That night, I didn't reach out to anyone. I didn't defend myself. I didn't try to clear the air. I let the silence do what it needed to do. And for the first time, instead of feeling like punishment, it felt like protection. Before bed, I checked my phone one last time. A new message from an unknown number flashed across the screen. They erased you from the family story. But they couldn't erase the truth. No signature, no explanation. My heart skipped, then steadied. I didn't reply. I didn't need to. Whatever was coming, it was clear that the version of me they thought they knew was already gone. I lay in the dark, staring at the ceiling, listening to the quiet. The house I'd grown up in felt farther away than ever, and for once that distance didn't hurt. Somewhere between being kicked out of that party and waking up alone the next morning, something fundamental had shifted. I had stopped waiting for my father to choose me. And that, I realized, as sleep finally took hold, changed everything. Silence has a way of telling the truth when words would only make things worse. I sat alone that evening, the lights low, the city humming outside my window, and asked myself a question I had avoided for years. Why had I never told them? Not about my plans, not about my boundaries, but about the one thing that would have changed everything the moment it left my mouth. The answer came easily, without drama or hesitation. Because silence kept me alive. There had been a time when I almost said it. Years ago, during an argument that felt small at the time but now glows in my memory like a warning sign I ignored. My father had accused me of being ungrateful, of thinking I was better than everyone else. My sister sat beside him, quiet for once, watching. I remember my chest tightening, the words rising in my throat. I wanted to tell him that I wasn't dependent on him anymore, that I didn't need his approval, his help, his permission. I wanted to say it all, but then he leaned back in his chair and said, "Anything you have belongs to this family." And just like that, I understood what would happen if I spoke. The truth about my life, about my independence, about my resources, would not be treated as my own. It would be claimed, dissected, repurposed into something I owed them. So I swallowed the words. I always did. The money was never a miracle. It wasn't luck or a sudden windfall or anything that fit neatly into the stories people like to tell. It came from a branch of my family that had been deliberately erased from the narrative I grew up with. A name that was never spoken. A history that was dismissed with vague explanations and sharp looks whenever I asked questions. I learned early which doors were not meant to be opened. What I didn't know then was that someone on the other side of that silence had been paying attention. Someone who believed that bloodlines mattered less than integrity, that legacy wasn't about control, but about protection. When that person passed, the inheritance didn't come with fanfare or lawyers at my door. It came quietly, carefully, placed out of reach of anyone who would see it as an opportunity instead of a responsibility. The account was in Switzerland, structured in layers, guarded by more than just passwords. It wasn't something you stumbled across. It was something you were entrusted with. I remember sitting across from a man in a neutral office years ago, his voice calm as he explained what I was being given and why. He didn't congratulate me. He didn't smile. He just said, "This is yours. And how you protect it will matter more than how you use it." I understood immediately what that meant for my family, or rather what it meant to keep it from them. Every lesson I had learned growing up pointed in the same direction. If they knew, they would want access. If they wanted access, they would demand justification. If they demanded justification, they would turn my life into a negotiation I would never win. So I said nothing. I kept my job modest, my lifestyle unremarkable. I let them believe the version of me that made them comfortable. There were moments when I saw suspicion flicker across my father's face, questions that lingered just a second too long, comments about how I always seemed to land on my feet. Once, my sister laughed and said, "You always have some kind of backup plan, don't you?" The way she said it made my skin prickle. I shrugged it off the way I always did, and changed the subject. I learned to erase digital trails, to delete emails the moment I read them, to keep my name out of conversations where curiosity could turn dangerous. One message from my bank still stands out in my memory. It had come late at night, a routine confirmation, nothing urgent. I read it, then deleted it immediately, my pulse racing for no reason other than instinct. I didn't want anything traceable, anything that could be discovered by accident. Paranoia, some might call it. I called it survival. Sitting there now, days after being thrown out of my own family party, I opened my laptop and logged in. The interface was clean, understated, numbers arranged in a way that didn't invite emotion. I didn't linger on the balance. I didn't need to. What mattered wasn't how much was there, but what it represented. Independence, safety. The ability to walk away when someone tried to reduce me to a role I never agreed to play. I made a call I hadn't planned on making so soon. My advisor answered on the second ring, his voice steady, familiar. We spoke in careful terms, the kind that assumed privacy but never relied on it. I told him about the party, about being asked to leave, about the sudden interest my family seemed to have in my behavior. He listened without interrupting. "If they ever find out," he said finally, "everything will change." I knew that. I had always known that. The truth wasn't just powerful. It was combustible. And once it was out, there would be no putting it back. After we hung up, I sat back and let the weight of it settle. I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel angry. I felt calm. That was the most surprising part. The humiliation of that night, the way my father's finger pointed toward the door, the sound of laughter dying down behind me, all of it hurt. But it hadn't shattered me. Because somewhere deep down, I had known something they didn't. I had known I wasn't trapped. That realization reframed everything. The way I had stood there without begging, the way I had walked out instead of apologizing. It wasn't courage, it wasn't pride, it was certainty. I didn't need them. I never had. My phone buzzed on the table, pulling me back into the present. A message from my father, longer than the others. He wanted to talk. He wanted to clear the air. He wanted to understand where this distance was coming from. I read it once, then set the phone aside. Another message followed, this time from my sister. Can we please just talk like adults? The phrasing almost made me laugh, as if adulthood, to her, meant compliance dressed up as conversation. I didn't respond, not because I was afraid of what I might say, but because I finally understood the value of saying nothing. Silence was no longer my shield. It was my leverage. Later that night, another message came in. This one from my advisor. They're looking for money, and they think you're the weakest link. I stared at the screen, a slow smile forming despite myself. Weak. That was the role they had cast me in my entire life. The one who would bend, who would fix things, who would step in when everyone else failed. They had no idea how wrong they were. I closed my laptop and stood by the window, watching the city lights flicker on one by one. Somewhere out there, my family was telling a story about me. A story where I was unstable, dramatic, difficult. A story where they were the reasonable ones, the injured ones, the ones who had tried. I let them have it. Stories lose their power when the person they're about no longer participates. The truth was still mine to control. And for the first time, I wasn't wondering if I should reveal it. I was deciding when. I went to bed that night with a clarity I had never felt before. The money wasn't a weapon. It wasn't a way to hurt them back. It was simply proof that I had options, that I could choose distance without fear, that I could let them underestimate me for as long as they wanted. They hadn't kicked me out because I was weak. They had kicked me out because they thought I was. And as sleep finally claimed me, I knew one thing for certain. The moment they realized the truth, it would already be too late to use it against me. Silence does something strange to people who are used to being obeyed. At first, they assume it's a mistake, a missed call, a delayed response, something that will correct itself if they just wait long enough. That was how my family treated my silence in the days after the party, like a temporary glitch, an inconvenience, not a decision. The first message came from my father the morning after I stopped replying altogether. "You're making this harder than it needs to be." I read it once, then set my phone down and went about my day. I went to work, I answered emails, I bought groceries. I lived my life in a way that didn't revolve around explaining myself, and that alone felt like a small rebellion. By the second day, the tone shifted. His messages grew longer, softer around the edges, weighted with disappointment instead of command. "I don't recognize you anymore. This isn't who you are. We raised you better than this." The words were familiar. They had always been his favorite way of pulling me back in. Redefine my boundaries as a character flaw. Turn my silence into a personal attack. Make me doubt my own reality. I didn't. My sister tried next. Her name flashed across my screen that afternoon, followed by a text that started with "hey" and ended with a heart emoji that felt wildly out of place. "I know things got heated. I just want us to move forward. Dad's really hurting." She didn't mention the party, she didn't mention what she'd said, she didn't mention the fact that I'd been told to leave like an unruly guest instead of a daughter. She talked about moving forward as if nothing had happened, as if the past could be erased by mutual agreement. I saw it for what it was, an invitation back into the same pattern. Apologize. Smooth things over. Accept your place. More messages followed, and what struck me wasn't their content so much as their similarity. Different senders, same language, same phrases, same emotional cues. It was like listening to a choir that had rehearsed without realizing how obvious the harmony was. Family is family. Don't let pride ruin everything. You know how your father gets. You're the reasonable one. The reasonable one. The one expected to absorb discomfort so others don't have to feel it. By the third day, the calls started. Aunts, uncles, cousins I hadn't spoken to in years suddenly concerned about the state of our family. Not one of them asked what I needed. They asked what I was going to do, whether I was ready to talk, whether I planned to apologize, whether I understood how embarrassed my father was. Each conversation felt like stepping into the same room with different furniture. The outcome was already decided. I was the problem to be managed. I kept notes, not out of paranoia, but out of clarity. Dates, times, words used, patterns emerging. It was the first time I'd ever documented my own experience instead of doubting it. And the more I wrote, the calmer I felt. This wasn't chaos. It was escalation. That realization came with an unexpected sense of control. My father's next message dropped the pretense entirely. If you don't come back and fix this, you'll regret it. There it was. The threat beneath the concern. The reminder that love, in his world, had always been conditional. I stared at the screen for a long moment, then turned my phone off and slid it into a drawer. I needed distance, not noise. That afternoon I called a lawyer. It felt strange, making that call. Not dramatic, not panicked, just practical. I explained the situation calmly, the party, the messages, the sudden pressure. I didn't embellish, I didn't minimize. I told the truth the way I was finally learning to tell it, without apology. They're escalating, he said after a pause. And when people like this escalate, it's rarely about reconciliation. It's about regaining control. His words settled into place like the final piece of a puzzle I'd been assembling my whole life. Control. That was always the point. Not family, not love. Control over the narrative, over resources, over me. I hung up and sat in the quiet of my apartment, letting the weight of that sink in. For years, I'd believed that my silence kept the peace, that my flexibility held the family together, that if I just tried harder, gave more, asked less, things would eventually feel fair. Now I saw the truth with uncomfortable clarity. My silence had never brought peace. It had just made their behavior easier. That night, the messages resumed. My father sent a long text that read like a confession, but felt like an indictment. He talked about sacrifice, about how much he'd done for us, about how hurt he was that I'd chosen to abandon the family when they needed unity. He never mentioned my sister. He never mentioned the moment he told me to leave. He framed himself as the wounded party, carrying the burden of a daughter who had suddenly become unrecognizable. I didn't respond. My sister followed with something sharper. You're being selfish. You always do this when things don't go your way. You think you're better than us now. The accusation stung, not because it was true, but because it echoed a belief they'd been planting since childhood. That wanting autonomy was arrogance, that independence was betrayal. I read it, then deleted it. The next morning, a relative I trusted more than most called. Her voice was hesitant, lower than usual. I wanted you to hear this from me, she said. People are saying things. She hesitated again. Your sister's telling everyone you've been unstable for months, that you've been distant, that she tried to help you but you shut her out. The words landed with a familiar weight. The narrative had fully shifted now. I wasn't just difficult, I was unreliable, emotional, a liability. I thanked her for telling me and hung up, my hand steady despite the tightness in my chest. I had expected this. When silence doesn't work, people like my family look for another way to discredit you. What surprised me was how little it hurt compared to the past. Maybe because this time, I wasn't trying to defend myself. I wasn't scrambling to prove I was sane, kind, reasonable enough to deserve respect. I already knew who I was. And for the first time, that knowledge didn't depend on their approval. Late that afternoon, my father called again. I watched the phone vibrate on the counter until it stopped. A minute later, another message came through. "You're tearing this family apart." I let out a slow breath, the words rolling off me like water. "No," I thought. "You're just finally seeing the cracks." As the day faded into evening, something shifted on the other end of the silence. The messages became erratic, shorter, angrier, less rehearsed. My father's authority was slipping, and he could feel it. My sister's confidence wavered, her texts swinging between apology and accusation. They were losing patience, losing their grip. That was when it hit me, clear and undeniable. For the first time in my life, they needed me more than I needed them. The realization didn't come with triumph. It came with a quiet, almost sad understanding. They had built their sense of stability on my compliance, my willingness to bend. Without it, everything felt unstable to them. And instead of asking why, they were trying to force things back into place. I sat on my couch that night, the room dim except for the soft glow of a lamp, and reread the messages one last time. Not to analyze them, not to prepare a response, just to acknowledge what they were. Proof. Proof that my silence wasn't cruelty. It was clarity. I turned my phone back on long enough to send a single message, not to my father, not to my sister, but to myself. A note in my phone that read simply, "You're allowed to stop explaining." Then I powered the phone off again and let the quiet settle. They thought silence meant fear. They thought it meant I was waiting, uncertain, ready to fold. What they didn't realize was that silence this time meant freedom. And the harder they pushed against it, the more obvious their desperation became. By the end of that week, I knew one thing for certain. Whatever came next, whether it was confrontation or legal threats or a sudden attempt at reconciliation, I was done playing the role they'd written for me. The moment they tried to force me back into place would be the moment they finally understood how badly they'd misjudged me. And somewhere deep down, beneath the calm, beneath the resolve, I felt it. The first unmistakable tremor of something shifting permanently out of their control. The invitation arrived the following Monday in a cream-colored envelope that felt heavier than paper had any right to feel. No return address, no warmth in the wording, just a stiff line of text informing me that the family would be gathering again, this time for a smaller, more private dinner, and that my presence was expected. Not requested. Expected. I stared at the card for a long time, sitting at my kitchen table with my coffee growing cold beside me. The phrasing was deliberate. This wasn't an apology or an olive branch. It was a summons. A quiet attempt to pull me back into the room where they believed they still held power. I didn't respond right away. That afternoon, my lawyer called. His voice was calm, professional, but there was an edge to it that made me sit up straighter. "They're testing you," he said. "This is what families like yours do when silence stops working. They create a stage. They want witnesses. Witnesses." The words stuck with me long after we hung up. The next day, my sister texted, "Just checking in. Hope you got the invite. Dad really wants everyone together." The smiley face at the end felt like an insult. I could practically hear her voice, sweet on the surface, sharp underneath. She had always loved an audience, loved being seen as the good daughter, the reasonable one, the victim of my supposed unpredictability. I typed nothing back. By Wednesday, my father called again. I let it ring. A voicemail followed, his tone measured, restrained in a way that told me he was choosing his words carefully. "This family doesn't air its issues in public," he said. "We handle things internally. I suggest you do the same." There it was again. The warning disguised as advice. That night, I lay awake replaying the party in my mind. The music, the laughter that had stopped when his voice cut through the room, the way he'd stood beside my sister, hand firm on her shoulder, eyes fixed on me like I'd crossed an invisible line. I remembered the heat rushing to my face, the sudden awareness of every pair of eyes on me as he told me to leave. Not quietly, not privately, in front of everyone. I had walked out with my head high, but the humiliation had followed me home like a shadow. By morning, my decision was made. I would go. Not because they expected me to, not because I owed them anything, but because this time, I would not be walking into that room as the woman they believed they could still control. I would walk in as myself, fully aware of what I carried, what I knew, and what they didn't. The night of the dinner, I dressed simply. No statement jewelry, no dramatic colors. Just clean lines, calm confidence. I didn't need to look powerful. I needed to be grounded. Before leaving, I paused at the door, taking a slow breath. This was not about revenge. It was about truth. The house was already full when I arrived. Laughter spilled out onto the driveway, the sound of glasses clinking, familiar voices rising and falling in practiced harmony. When I stepped inside, the room shifted almost imperceptibly. Conversations paused for half a second too long. Eyes flickered toward me, then away. I felt it, the tension humming just beneath the surface like static before a storm. My father spotted me first. His posture stiffened, surprise flashing across his face before he smoothed it away. He approached with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "You came," he said, as if he hadn't spent days insisting that I should. I nodded. "You asked me to." He gestured toward the living room, where my sister stood holding court near the fireplace. She turned when she saw us, her smile widening, a practiced display of relief and affection. I knew that smile. It was the same one she'd worn when teachers praised her for things I'd done, when relatives complimented her generosity after she volunteered my time. I moved through the room slowly, aware of every step. People greeted me with cautious warmth, curiosity barely concealed. I caught snippets of whispered conversations trailing off as I passed. She actually showed up. I wonder what she's planning. I took a seat near the edge of the gathering, deliberately not inserting myself into the center. Let them wonder. Let them fill the silence with their own assumptions. Dinner was served, and we gathered around the long table that had hosted decades of family milestones. Birthdays, holidays, celebrations I'd always attended as the supporting character. My father stood at the head, glass raised, launching into a toast about unity and forgiveness. His words were vague, carefully chosen to suggest conflict without naming it. Several people nodded along, glancing at me, then at my sister. When he finished, my sister reached for his hand, squeezing it theatrically. "We're just so grateful to be together," she said, voice soft, eyes shining. "Family is everything." I felt the familiar urge to shrink, to stay quiet, to let the moment pass without disturbance. That urge had been trained into me over years of dinners just like this. But something inside me had shifted. I set my fork down gently. "I'd like to say something," I said. The room fell silent. My father's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. My sister's smile froze. All eyes turned toward me, anticipation and unease mixing in the air. I stood slowly, heart steady, voice calm. "I want to clarify something," I continued, "because there seems to be a lot of confusion about what happened at the last family gathering." A ripple moved through the room. I felt it, the collective lean forward, the hunger for drama. "I was asked to leave," I said simply. Not because I caused a scene, not because I was disrespectful, but because I disagreed with something my sister said, and my father chose to publicly side with her. "That's the truth." My sister laughed lightly, a dismissive sound. "That's not how it happened," she said quickly. "You're oversimplifying." I met her gaze. Am I? My father cleared his throat. "This isn't the place for this conversation," he said sharply. I nodded. "You're right. It should have been handled privately. That's why I was surprised when you chose to handle it publicly." A murmur spread through the room. Someone shifted uncomfortably in their chair. My sister's eyes darted toward my father, then back to me, irritation creeping into her expression. "I'm not here to argue," I said. "I'm here because I was invited. But I won't sit quietly while my absence is used to rewrite what happened." My father's face flushed. "You're being dramatic," he snapped. "This is exactly the behavior." I raised a hand gently. "Please don't." The room went very still. I took a breath. For years, I've been the one expected to smooth things over, to absorb discomfort, to keep the peace. Tonight I'm choosing honesty instead. My sister pushed her chair back slightly. "So what? You're here to embarrass us?" She laughed again, sharper this time. "To make yourself look like some kind of victim?" I shook my head. "No. I'm here because I won't be erased from my own story." The words hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. My father stood abruptly. "That's enough," he said. "Sit down." I didn't. Something flickered in his eyes then. Not anger, fear. Fear of losing control of the room, of the narrative he'd curated so carefully. Around us, relatives exchanged glances, uncertainty replacing their earlier judgment. "I'm going to leave now," I said calmly. "Not because I'm being told to, but because I've said what needed to be said." I reached for my coat. As I turned, I caught my sister's expression, the mask finally slipping. Beneath the charm was something raw and unsettled. She hadn't expected this, hadn't expected me to stand my ground without raising my voice. As I walked toward the door, my father called after me, "Don't do this." I paused, hand on the doorknob, and looked back at him. "I'm not doing anything," I said quietly. "I'm just no longer playing my part." I stepped outside into the cool night air, the door closing softly behind me. The sound of voices resumed inside, but they were different now, lower, uneasy. I stood on the porch for a moment, breathing deeply, letting the tension drain from my shoulders. As I drove away, my phone buzzed. A message from my sister. "You think you've won something tonight." I smiled faintly, setting the phone face down on the passenger seat. This wasn't a victory. It was a line drawn. They still had no idea what I held, what I knew, or how unprepared they were for what came next. But tonight, for the first time, the balance had shifted. And they felt it. The fallout from that dinner didn't come all at once. It crept in slowly, like a pressure change you only notice once your ears start ringing. The next morning, my phone was quiet, and that silence felt deliberate, calculated. They were regrouping. I could feel it. I went to work anyway, slipping back into routines that grounded me. Coffee, emails, meetings, numbers that made sense. My professional life had always been the one place where effort equaled outcome, where clarity mattered more than hierarchy. It was also the one part of my life my family never truly understood, which made it safer than anything else. Around mid-morning, my assistant knocked softly on my office door. "There's someone here to see you," she said carefully. "He says it's urgent." I didn't need her to finish the sentence. I already knew. My father stood in the hallway outside my office, arms crossed, jaw set. He looked out of place among the glass walls and quiet efficiency, like a relic dropped into the wrong decade. People glanced at him, then at me, curiosity flickering behind polite expressions. "We need to talk," he said without preamble. I met his gaze evenly. "You should have called," he scoffed. "You stopped answering." I gestured toward the small conference room nearby. 5 minutes. Inside, the air felt heavier. He didn't sit. He paced instead, the way he always did when he wanted to appear in control while feeling anything but. "You embarrassed me last night," he said finally, "in front of everyone." I leaned back in my chair. "You embarrassed yourself." His head snapped toward me. "Don't twist this. Your sister was hurt. You turned a family dinner into a spectacle." I kept my voice calm. "You turned it into a spectacle when you told me to leave at the last party. I simply refused to pretend it didn't happen." He shook his head, lips thinning. "You've changed." "Yes," I said simply. I have. That answer seemed to throw him off more than any argument could have. He stared at me for a moment, searching for the daughter he remembered, the one who would soften, apologize, back down. When he didn't find her, his tone shifted. You think you're untouchable now, he said quietly. I don't know where this confidence came from, but don't forget where you came from. I almost laughed. I know exactly where I came from, I said. That's why I won't go back. His eyes narrowed. Is this about money? There it was. The first crack. I raised an eyebrow. What makes you ask that? He hesitated, then waved a hand dismissively. You've been acting different, distant, like you don't need us anymore. I didn't answer. Silence, I was learning, was far more effective than denial. He leaned forward, lowering his voice. Your sister thinks you're hiding something. I met his gaze again, unflinching. I'm hiding my peace. He scoffed, straightening. If you think walking away gives you leverage, you're wrong. Family is leverage. Reputation is leverage. I stood then, signaling the conversation was over. Not when it's built on control. His face hardened. You're making a mistake. I smiled, small and sad. That's what you said when I went to college. When I took my first job. When I refused to lend you money the first time. Funny how every boundary looks like a mistake to the person who benefited from you having none. I opened the door. He stared at me for a long moment, then walked out without another word. That afternoon, my sister called. I didn't answer. By evening, the pressure came from a different angle. An email from an uncle. Subject line concerned. He wrote about loyalty, about how families handle disagreements privately, about how my father was under a lot of stress. He suggested I consider the bigger picture. I deleted it. What they didn't know, what they couldn't know yet, was that I'd already been considering the bigger picture for years. Quietly, strategically. While they argued over seating arrangements and inheritance assumptions, I had built something entirely separate from them. The Swiss account wasn't a sudden windfall. It wasn't luck. It was the result of decisions made long before they ever imagined I could make them. Late that night, I sat at my kitchen table with my laptop open, reviewing documents I rarely needed to touch anymore. Account statements, trust structures, offshore holdings established through legitimate channels, layers of compliance and discretion. $3 billion doesn't appear overnight. It grows slowly, patiently when you understand how systems work and when to stay silent. I thought about the irony of it all. My family had always underestimated me because I never talked about money the way they did. I didn't brag, I didn't borrow, I didn't compete. While my sister measured worth in designer labels, and my father obsessed over appearances, I invested, I diversified, I planned, and I stayed invisible. The next day, the rumors started. I heard them secondhand at first. A colleague mentioned that someone had asked strange questions about me at a networking event. Another forwarded me a message from a mutual acquaintance, asking if everything was okay, if I was in trouble. The narrative was shifting again, but this time with an edge of suspicion. By Friday, my sister texted me directly. We need to talk. This is getting out of hand. I replied with a single sentence. I agree. We met at a cafe halfway between our offices, neutral ground. She arrived first, perfectly styled, fingers tapping impatiently against her cup. When she saw me, her expression tightened, then smoothed. You look relaxed, she said, studying me. I am. She leaned in. Dad's worried. People are talking. There are questions about you, about where you've been, what you're doing. I sipped my coffee. People talk. Her eyes sharpened. You're enjoying this. I shook my head. No, I'm done managing everyone else's emotions. She exhaled sharply. You can't just disappear and expect things to stay the same. I met her gaze. That's exactly what I expect. She scoffed. You think you're above us now? I tilted my head. Do you really want an answer to that? Her jaw clenched. You always do this. You act calm, superior, like you're holding some kind of secret. I smiled faintly. Maybe I am. She leaned back, crossing her arms. If you're trying to scare us, it's not working. I finished my coffee and stood. Good. That was when her composure cracked. You think Dad won't find out eventually? She snapped. Whatever you're hiding, it always comes out. I paused, looking down at her. Some things only come out when you choose the timing. I left her there, fuming. That evening, my lawyer called again. They've started digging, he said. Your father contacted an accountant, asked some questions that don't make sense unless he suspects something significant. I smiled to myself. Let him dig. The following week felt like the calm before a storm. No more messages, no surprise visits, just an uneasy quiet that told me they were connecting dots. However poorly, I went about my life, attended meetings, closed deals. Every normal action felt surreal, knowing how dramatically the ground beneath my family was about to shift. On Thursday night, I received a formal invitation, a charity gala, black tie, hosted by one of the largest financial institutions in the region. My name was listed as a keynote donor. I stared at the email for a long time. This wasn't my doing, not directly, but I knew exactly who had arranged it. One of my long-term partners, someone who respected discretion but believed in visibility when it mattered. The gala was public. Press would be there, investors, board members, people who understood numbers at a level my family never had. And my father? He had been invited too. The pieces slid into place with almost poetic precision. I replied with a single word. Confirmed. The night of the gala, I stood in front of my mirror longer than usual, adjusting the simple black dress I'd chosen. No logos, no excess, just quiet authority. As I slipped on my shoes, I felt no nerves, only a steady resolve. This wasn't about humiliation. It was about reality. When I arrived, the venue buzzed with energy, crystal chandeliers, low conversations humming with influence. As I stepped inside, recognition sparked in a few eyes. Heads turned, whispers followed. I moved through the room with ease, greeting familiar faces. When my name was announced later that evening, the applause was polite but curious. I took the stage, microphone cool in my hand. Thank you, I said, voice steady. I believe in supporting institutions that value long-term thinking, transparency, and impact. I spoke briefly, purposefully. I didn't mention figures. I didn't need to. But as I stepped down, I saw them. My father stood frozen near the back of the room, my sister beside him, her face pale. They stared at me like they were seeing a stranger, one who had been hiding in plain sight. Later, as the event wound down, a journalist approached. Can you confirm the rumors about your holdings? She asked lightly. I smiled. I can confirm that I've been fortunate. Across the room, my father's world was collapsing in real time. And for the first time, I knew without doubt that the moment they had tried to control me publicly was about to be answered, not with anger, but with undeniable truth. The next morning, my phone didn't stop ringing. I let it ring while I made coffee, while I stood by the window watching the city wake up, while I breathed in the quiet that still belonged to me. The caller ID flashed my father's name again and again, then my sister's, then numbers I didn't recognize but already knew by instinct. Their silence had ended. Panic had replaced strategy. I answered none of them. By mid-morning, the messages shifted from frantic to carefully worded. My father left a voicemail that sounded nothing like the man who had ordered me out of a family party days earlier. His voice was lower, strained, almost pleading. We need to talk. There's been a misunderstanding. Things got blown out of proportion. Call me back. A misunderstanding. I deleted it without listening twice. My sister's text followed minutes later. We saw you last night. Why didn't you tell us? Her typing bubbles appeared and disappeared before another message came through. Dad's really upset. You humiliated him. I stared at the screen, feeling something settle deep in my chest. Not anger, not satisfaction, finality. I typed one line. I didn't humiliate him. I told the truth. Then I muted the thread. The fallout spread quickly, faster than even I expected. By lunchtime, my assistant quietly informed me that my father had called the office twice, asking to speak with me personally. She'd followed my instructions and declined. The third time, he'd raised his voice. The fourth, he'd hung up without saying anything. People were talking now, not just within the family, but outside of it. The gala had done exactly what it was meant to do. It had placed me in a context my family couldn't control, among people who understood power not as noise, but as structure. That afternoon, I received an email from an acquaintance I hadn't spoken to in years. "Congratulations on the recognition last night. Didn't realize you were involved at that level." The wording was polite, but curiosity hummed beneath it. Others followed, some congratulatory, some probing, some pretending not to probe at all. I answered none of them. By evening, my father showed up at my apartment building. Security called me before he ever reached the lobby. "There's a man here insisting he's your father. He seems agitated." I closed my eyes for a moment. "I'm not available," I said calmly. "Please ask him to leave." There was a pause. "He says he won't." I exhaled slowly. "Then involve building management." 10 minutes later, my phone buzzed with a text from my sister. "Are you really doing this? Kicking Dad out like a stranger?" I set the phone down and walked away from it. Later that night, I stood at my kitchen counter scrolling through an article someone had sent me anonymously. It was a short piece from a financial blog, subtle but devastating. It mentioned the gala, the donor list, and in one careful paragraph, referenced a private Swiss holding linked to long-term investments across multiple sectors. My name wasn't plastered across it, but it didn't need to be. Anyone with basic financial literacy could connect the dots. My family didn't have that literacy. That was clear from the voicemail my father left an hour later, his voice tight with something between anger and fear. "What the hell is going on? Who are you working with? How much money do you actually have?" I almost laughed. He still thought information was something he could demand. The next day, I agreed to one meeting. Not with my family, with my lawyer and a private security consultant. We talked through contingencies calmly, clinically, harassment, reputation management, protective orders if necessary. It wasn't paranoia, it was preparation. When you grow up in a family that equates control with love, you learn early that boundaries are dangerous. I was unlearning that now, replacing fear with foresight. By Thursday, my sister cornered me in a way I couldn't avoid. I stepped out of a meeting and nearly collided with her in the lobby downstairs. Her eyes were rimmed red, makeup hastily applied, composure cracked beyond repair. She grabbed my arm before I could step back. "Don't walk away," she hissed. I pulled my arm free. "Don't touch me." People glanced over. She didn't care. "You think you can just rewrite everything?" she said, voice shaking. "Do you have any idea what you've done to Dad?" I looked at her, really looked at her, and saw something I hadn't noticed before. Not confidence, not superiority, fear, raw and unfiltered. "What I've done," I said quietly, "is stop lying for you." Her breath hitched. "You're acting like you're better than us." I shook my head. "I'm acting like I'm done being less." She swallowed hard. "How much is it?" I paused. "How much is what?" "The money," she snapped. "Everyone's talking. Dad says you're hiding billions." I met her gaze evenly. "Dad doesn't get to know my finances." Her face twisted. "You owe us." The words were automatic, reflexive. I felt a strange sadness then, not for myself, but for her. She had been trained just as thoroughly as I had, only in a different role. Favored didn't mean free. "I owe you nothing," I said softly. "And neither does the truth." She stepped back as if struck. That night, my father sent an email. Not a text, not a call. An email long enough to scroll twice. He wrote about sacrifice, about reputation, about how he had always defended me, how ungrateful it was for me to let people think things about him that weren't true. He demanded a meeting. He demanded clarity. He demanded respect. I read it once. Then I forwarded it to my lawyer and archived it. The following week, the pressure reached its peak. My father called an emergency family meeting. No invitation this time, just a message sent through multiple relatives. We need to clear the air. This has gone too far. I declined. Instead, I attended another event. Smaller, more discreet. A private